Sorry. I'll try in 10 minutes to give you in broad strokes who we're dealing with in China, what are China's goals right now, what are the tactics China is using, and what are the prospects. At the risk of oversimplifying, we're dealing with a China that's very different from the time of Mao and the time of Deng Xiaoping. It is no longer the strongman model, no longer applies in China now. What you have is in the recent party congress, is the election of the top leadership composed of 7 people. And they really rule by consensus. The General Secretary, the new party leader, Xi Jinping, and the number 2 man who is expected to be the new premier, Li Keqiang. They're like the first and second among equals, but they'll have to persuade not only the other 5 people in the standing committee, but the other members of the Politburo before they can get their way done. And we're not yet done with the leadership transition. Although the party congress just ended a few weeks ago, the transition really goes all the way to March and thereafter. Because what is happening now is we have a new party leader and a new military commander-in-chief, but he will become the president in March. And then the premier takes over, the foreign minister steps down, the foreign policy czar will retire, so you will have a reshuffling of a lot of people before the policy really settles down. But what is the message that the recent party congress gave us? One is a reassuring message, and the other one is also an ominous message. The reassuring message is that China will continue to stress economic development, that they want to double their GDP and the per capita income in the next 10 years, and they want to focus their efforts on that. The other reassuring message is that China wants to continue on what it calls as the path of peaceful development. And just briefly, the reason they came up with this path of peaceful development is because in recent world history, whenever a rising power rises and challenges established power, the only way to resolve that contradiction was through war. So we now have a country that is trying for the first time in world history to become a power and to avoid war. Is war therefore inevitable? China says no. The established power, the US, also is aware of this history. And that's why Hillary Clinton, in her recent visit to China, said that China and the US are trying to find a new answer to the question of what happens when a rising power meets established power. So these are the 2 reassuring messages we see from the recent party congress. What is disturbing though, and what is ominous, is the other message, that they will continue and try to accomplish their military modernization by 2020 and build a military that is commensurate to their economic and political stature, to their economic stature. Now they're the second biggest economy, so that means they will build up their military to a corresponding stature. The other ominous message is that while they want to stick to the road of peaceful development, they will remain firm in defending their sovereignty and in their territorial integrity. So the key issue is how do they define what is their territory that they will defend. Because as we saw with the 9-dash line, they claim all the islands and the adjacent waters within the 9-dash line. And because of the overlapping claims, if they were under the guise or under the name of defending their territorial integrity, if they were to try and recover all their so-called blessed territories, this will definitely go against the path of peaceful development. And this, I think, will be the logic that will determine China's future development. Whether it sticks, strictly speaking, in action, in its behavior, to achieving peaceful development, or whether it puts the emphasis on recovering their lost territories in their view. So what are China's tactics? Before I go there, I just want to add one thing in terms of what is at stake. The video at the beginning already lined up the question of sovereignty, and second, the question of economic resources. The third one, which actually complicates the picture, is the issue of the strategic rivalry between the US, the established power, and China, the rising power. At present, the balance of power is in favor of the US. Based on the estimate of the London-based International Institute of Strategic Studies, the US and its military power still has strategic primacy in the Asia-Pacific region, and China will not be able to challenge that for the next 10 to 20 years. I put it more at 10 years, because China tends to overshoot the target. And they're trying to achieve, at some point, strategic parity, because they will not be able to achieve strategic dominance in the Asia-Pacific region for quite some time. Given that, it is interesting, as we deal with China's tactics, to see, as a case study, of how China behaved in the case of the Hainan Declaration. Starting January 1, the Chinese police force of Hainan will board the ships that illegally entered China's territorial waters. This, of course, created a lot of alarm all over the world. And then we see, first yesterday, and then this morning, for those who followed, the interviews given to the New York Times and to Bloomberg and to other news agencies by the Hainan official who is supposed to carry out the new regulations. First he said it will only be limited to the 12 nautical mile territory of China. And then he adds, however, it will extend to the disputed islands in the South China Sea, which would mean, of course, possible conflict with the Philippines and other Southeast Asian countries. This morning, he comes out again and says, no, it will only apply to the 12 miles where the Chinese have declared baselines, meaning from their mainland, Hainan, and the Paracels, and the Spratlys, and the Scarborough, where they have not declared baselines, are not included. So you have a case here where they reveal what they want to do, and then they try to backtrack. Also because this was a decision by Hainan. And you don't hear anything from Xi Jinping or Li Keqiang except a statement from the foreign ministry on the first day, a one-line statement when he was asked, what is the goal of this regulation? Mainly maintaining that it is the right of China to manage its maritime territory. And then the second day, he finally says more, saying that we will still observe the freedom of navigation. Why is that important? Because of the strategic rivalry. If there is anything that will arouse the interest, if not the challenge, from the US and Japan and Australia, it would be for China to deny freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. So that is why you see that while their goal, their maximum goal, as they define it, is to recover all the islands in the South China Sea, and now recently including the East China Sea, as we see in the trouble with Japan, you still see the tactic of 2 steps forward and then stepping back, especially when there is one element that they recognize. The Chinese are students of realpolitik. They know they cannot challenge the US at this point. So that is why you see this backtracking happening. The other element in the tactics is that the Chinese have realized that in terms of international law, their problem is that they may have a historical claim, but the historical claim does not transform to a historical title unless you can establish effective occupation. And they did not occupy anything until 1974, 1988, 1995. And now, as we saw in Scarborough, that's what they're trying to do. So, from the point of view of the Philippines, being a smaller power, we cannot afford, there's the margin for error is very small. If we try to reassert in a way that we cannot sustain it, the Chinese will take over the initiative. And what you seek to achieve, to assert your sovereignty, you actually achieve the opposite. You lose your sovereignty, as what we saw in Scarborough, and hopefully it does not become a permanent situation. But the point is that another tactic the Chinese are using, aside from taking advantage of mistakes being made by the other claimant countries, is the development of what we can call the Chinese White Navy, as opposed to the regular gray Navy. There is an element here of aggressiveness because they have developed so many coastal patrol ships. But there's an element of restraint because they're not using their navy and they're not firing a shot. And there's an element of Sun Tzu here. If you can win without firing a shot, and if you could win by just announcing regulations to scare people, then that is the test of the best general. Of course, as we see, the Chinese, though, in their policy, actually, what they have produced is something that they did not anticipate. By trying to assert their sovereignty during the past 2 to 3 years, they have actually aligned, they have made Southeast Asia-Pacific region almost divided it into 2 camps. You have Japan, and you have the Philippines, US, and the pro-US alliance. And then you have China, Laos, Cambodia. It's almost like we're dividing into a pro-US and a pro-China camp. And it is the beginning of another Cold War. Although a Cold War is better than a hot war at this point. So this is the challenge that we face. What then are the prospects? In terms of sovereignty and the struggle, the assertion of sovereignty, I think we should be prepared for a protracted struggle. I do not expect the Chinese to give up on the issue of sovereignty. It will only change if the Chinese were to give up the 9-dash line, which I don't expect in the near future. Although there were indications a few weeks ago that the researchers of China and Taiwan would get together and come out within a year, come up with a legal basis to explain the basis of the 9-dash line. If I can backtrack one more time, when they made their claim in a letter to the United Nations in 2009, and they included the 9-dash line for the first time as a UN document, there were 2 things to take note of. One was that they were presenting their maximalist claim. I think the Chinese are realistic that they will not be able to achieve all of it, but if they could, they would try to do so. But the second thing is that they try to do it within the framework of UNCLOS. So there is the possible reassuring sign. And also in the struggle over the Senkakus, when Japan valiantly showed the Chinese that with their Coast Guard, they could actually show the Chinese that you cannot take over so easily. The Chinese announced baselines and again submitted it to the UN within the framework of UNCLOS. Does this mean that it is possible the Chinese will eventually accept UNCLOS or the ICJ? It is difficult to say in the near future, but there is already one Chinese judge sitting in the International Court of Justice, and there is already one Chinese judge sitting in UNCLOS. So there is this process of socialization where the Chinese are trying to study, and they're preparing different options. Lastly, the only prospect, I think, for developing the natural gas deposit, for example, the Reef Bank or Recto Bank, is through some form of joint exploration. The Chinese have made it clear that they will not allow unilateral exploitation, but they are willing to share it with the claimant countries. The devil, of course, is in the details. How to come up with a contract involving the private sector where the sovereignty can be shelved, where both sides can agree to international arbitration as the way to resolve dispute. That I leave to the lawyers and the businessmen to solve. And on that note, I think basically the thing to watch would be whether China proceeds on its path to peaceful development or whether it takes the road of ultranationalism and tries to recover all their so-called lost territories. And this will determine what kind of major power China will be in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chito. So, after that ominous discussion, you should take a deep breath again and relax, and let me assure you that we will end on a positive note, in spite of Chito's cold downs of reality, which is actually what we also need. But we are going to end the formal discussion part really with the theme of cooperation, the at least strategic approach. And I know that our next discussant has looked at, also looks at this riddle from different angles. So Henry will be actually discussing the opportunities for cooperation in the ASEAN framework. Also something about the some discussion on the code of conduct for the upcoming ASEAN meetings. But at the same time, Henry has already a rich experience, not just on cooperation issues, but on national security issues, and also very important aspect of the rule of law when it comes to dealing with maritime boundaries. So that is the richness of what Henry brings with us. I just fear that after Henry's discussion, as Senator Shahani mentioned, that they should form a team, DFA, that will stay at the Home Office rather than be assigned to another post, so that you can stay and help the country deal with this issue. I fear that Henry's assignment outside might be delayed. So, without further ado, Henry, Bensurto.